we get resentful when a boundary is crossed. That's when we start to feel resentment. So if we start to feel resentment and anger towards someone, we may want to look at, was a boundary crossed? And if it was, is that fair? Did I actually communicate that boundary clearly to that person? Which is why clarity is the next pillar, the third pillar in the 5 pillars.
Hello, today I'm talking with and learning from Maria Ross. She's a brand strategist, she's a speaker and an author, and she believes that cash flow, creativity, and compassion are not mutually exclusive. She's the founder of a business called Red Slice, which is a brand strategy consultancy. But we're not talking to her today about brand strategy consultancy. I'm talking to her today and learning about empathy. Now, she's written a new book called The Empathy Dilemma. And this is one of these guests where the soft stuff is the hard stuff. And she believes that empathetic leaders are required to run high performance teams. So we're going to get into the 5 pillars of her effective empathy leadership framework. And some of the stuff that we talked about, actually, that we didn't record, which might be interesting, is the number one trait for high performing salespeople is empathy plus ambition. And the number one trait for empathetic leaders is curiosity. So I think there's something in here for both sales leaders and CEOs. This is a great conversation with Maria. Lots to take away. I'm sure you'll love it.
Hi, I'm Maria Ross. I am based in Northern California, outside of Sacramento, and I am a speaker, an author, a leadership trainer, brand strategist, and essentially an empathy advocate that helps forward-thinking leaders and teams embrace empathy to achieve radical success. And I'm all about helping people uncover and discover that empathy is actually a strength, not a weakness, that will help them build better relationships, better team cultures, and ultimately better companies.
Fantastic. Can I start with one brand strategy? Where does that fit in with?
Yeah. So the Cliff Notes, the short notes version is that I've actually been a marketing executive, a consultant, and a brand strategist for most of my career. I started my business, Red Slice, in 2008 to help organizations tell their brand story and connect and engage the right people, whether it was customers, clients, for nonprofits, donors. The whole crux of that work is about empathy. It's about understanding who your ideal audience is, what they care about, what they aspire to be, what their fears are. So empathy's always been this strength and this superpower within my business and within my work. And I wrote a few books, and in 2019, I wrote my 3rd book. I published my 3rd book called The Empathy Edge, which was an exploration of how empathy is a strategic advantage for leaders, for teams, and for brands. And it came out of the brand strategy work, but it also came out of some personal motivation to try to find leaders and teams that were winning with empathy for my son that I was trying to raise to be a good human being. He was 2.5 at the time. And I was delighted to find the data and the research that proved that empathy is not just good for society, it's great for business too.
Why does it feel like empathy's a bad thing? Why does that myth persist?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of myths about empathy, and I think that that's what prevents leaders from really embracing it as the catalyst that it can be. So the myths of empathy is that it's just about being nice. You can be a nice person, but it doesn't mean you see my point of view. And it doesn't mean you have to cave into unreasonable demands. You can actually make really tough business decisions, but do so with empathy. I talk about on my podcast, The Empathy Edge, I talk about doing layoffs with empathy, making hard decisions, but really being there for the people and what they're going through and what they're feeling. And then it's also not about agreeing with someone, which I think is really important in our world today. We can have empathetic conversations, and the goal of empathy is to connect, not convert. And so I want to understand your point of view and understand where you're coming from and your context, but it doesn't mean I have to walk away agreeing with you. So I can just find a way forward by eventually finding some common ground. And it might help to talk about the definition of empathy that I use for the lens of my work.
Maybe that's where we start. How do you define empathy then?
Yeah. So when I was researching the first empathy book, The Empathy Edge, the new one that came out is called The Empathy Dilemma. But when I was researching that, everybody I talked to had a different definition of empathy. And even the definition has even changed over time from the 1500s to the 1700s to today. So the one that really resonates, especially in the business world where you're trying to understand what's going on, is to understand that empathy is the ability to see, understand, and where appropriate, feel another person's perspective. And further, use that information to act with compassion. So compassion is empathy in action. It's the next right step I take based on the information I'm getting from you. And so when I speak to leadership teams, when I speak to executives, I tell them, think of it as information gathering. Think of it as detective work. I'm just trying to understand your perspective and where you're coming from so we can move the conversation or the relationship forward. It doesn't have to mean you're crying on the floor with your employees. It doesn't have to mean you, again, give in to unreasonable demands all the time to keep everyone, quote unquote, happy. It just means that you have a curiosity and a desire to hear and see someone else's point of view. And then now that you know their context and where they're coming from, you can move forward together.
Is empathy not perceived by the other person? Because I'm just thinking back, thinking back to a podcast I did about psychopaths a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And what we were talking about is that CEOs are actually functioning psychopaths, as are many surgeons, right? Because you wouldn't want your surgeon to be overwhelmed by the work that they do. And that's one of the 100%. Examples you give is like people in caring professions can be overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And Kevin was saying, look, people can learn to be empathetic so that the person perceives them as empathetic, even though it's actually from their perspective learned, because they realize that it's a useful thing to appear to be doing. That doesn't break your definition, but it's like, I might not be naturally empathetic, but I've decided being perceived as empathetic is powerful.
Yeah. Well, I always call BS on the I'm not good at empathy, because science shows us that we as humans are born with empathy. It's how we've survived as a species. What happens, barring any, outlying psychopathies, right? Most of us have that empathy. There's been studies on babies and children. We're primed for it. But what happens to us is that in our lives, based on our environment, our family, our workplace, that muscle can atrophy. And so just like any other muscle, when you don't know how to flex that muscle, when you've been in environments where empathy is not modeled, it's not rewarded, it's not celebrated, that muscle's not going to work well, right? Other people were very lucky. They grew up in environments where that muscle was strengthened. And so we as adults can learn empathy. It's the excuse of leaders that just like, I don't want to do the work, right? It's going to be harder because you have to have more of an intention, right? It's like someone who's never worked out before going to the gym for the first time. It's going to hurt. It's going to feel sore. It's going to feel uncomfortable, but you've got to build that muscle memory. And as an adult, you can build that skill. You can strengthen that muscle, but you're going to be doing so with more intention, with more active trying to make it work versus, some of my work has crossed into researching where they're trying to help children strengthen their empathy from the start. So it becomes part of their identity. A lot of schools, there's a great movement out of the UK called Empathy Week.
Right.
Yes. And it's organized with schools worldwide to help kids practice empathy. It's organized by a wonderful gentleman named Ed Kerwin out of the UK. And it's really about helping kids embrace that as part of their identity from the get-go so they don't lose it as they become adults. And then when they become adults, maybe they don't need books and work like mine to show them how to strengthen that muscle because it's already a part of who they are and how they operate in the world.
And do you think there's something about the education system, unless you're being deliberate about that also doesn't value empathy?
I absolutely do. I think we don't put enough focus on social and emotional learning for kids. I have a 10-and-a-half-year-old, and I've been fortunate that his schools are willing to look into that. They try to bring in that into the curriculum. But a lot of schools don't. It's very much about, it's performance-based, it's achievement-based, it's you take care of you and you worry about you, and that's all you need to worry about. And, the pandemic didn't do us any favors with, keeping kids in an environment where they weren't learning those skills or socially interacting with each other, and sort of having the rules of the pack show them what's appropriate and what's not. And so, it's a really interesting thing that we're seeing. You can pick your study that shows that the younger generations are the most empathetic we've ever seen or the least empathetic we've ever seen, right? You can support your argument with whatever data you want to choose. But what is a little bit more pervasive is that, with kids being a little bit more savvy about information, with them having transparency to information and how people are treated around the world and how people are treated in places where they don't live, they are embracing other points of view and diversity and empathy more than previous generations. And quite frankly, it's because the younger millennials and Gen Z are among the most diverse generations we're seeing, specifically in the workplace. So they have learned to tap into the power of difference to make better business decisions, to move things forward. Many of them have learned how to value that. Now, whether they are strong with their empathy or not to harness the value of those differences, that again depends on their environment and what they've grown up with. But to your original question, I think that schools could be doing more. I think that we could be doing more with our young people around them.
And what are some of the specific things there that they're doing in your son's school that what they're not doing elsewhere?
As an empathy trainer and speaker, I did kind of force his old school where we were in San Francisco to get involved with Empathy Week. And it was really eye-opening. But that school also did place an emphasis on social and emotional learning, on sharing, on collaboration, on conflict resolution. And the school he's in now that we've moved over the summer continues to do that. They actually have things within their curriculum that are addressing that. And that's how they try to solve problems. And they help the kids problem solve together.
So conflict resolution, collaboration. What was the other one?
Problem solving, just collaboration, better communication. Yeah.
The reason I pick up on those two particularly is because the work that I do with CEOs and their leadership teams, I'm constantly trying to get people to increase the level of constructive conflict because they're conflict averse. And also one of the things that I see a lot is that to be promoted, particularly, so if pick sales, just because it's a thing, right? So it's salesperson, sales manager, sales director, VP, whatever, and you end up being at the top, whatever the top is, and you're now on an executive team. Yeah. To get promoted, you didn't have to collaborate. And then I see people being promoted to the executive team in a company, and for the first time, it's not what they know that got them promoted before. Now it's a level, and they have no skill. They have no ability to collaborate or do conflict resolution or even, they express their frustration at a colleague in a way that it's just crippling. And so you've got all these people sitting in the room going, God, you're driving me mad. But so what happens is occasionally they explode because they can't
emotionally regulate.
They can't do it without, they can't, it's all or nothing. It's like becomes a binary thing.
Okay. So this is my wheelhouse because you had me down a rabbit hole of education and that's not my expertise, but except for being a parent. But this is the thing about, this is what I really tried to do with the second book, with the empathy dilemma. So I wrote The Empathy Edge in 2019 as the business case to convince the skeptics that empathy was worth looking at. It actually impacts the bottom line. And here's the ROI. That book was for the skeptics. Over the years since that was published, I was doing leadership trainings. I was doing keynotes. I did a TEDx talk to talk about all of this. And then I got people going, right, Maria, we get it. We're on board with human-centered leadership and empathy as a powerful catalyst. But here's where it gets hard. And they would bring up things like exactly what you're talking about. And so the reason I wrote The Empathy Dilemma was about how you can balance empathy with performance, high performance, and with your own personal boundaries. And there's 5 pillars in there. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because of exactly what you said. The first 2 pillars of how to be both an empathetic and an effective leader are self-awareness and self-care. So you're wondering, why is it about me if it's about empathy? And it's because many of us have risen in the ranks, and depending on the environment and the culture we're in, and even the function we're in, like you mentioned sales, which we'll talk about in a second, because I've got some news for you on that. We've come into an environment where it's been all about us. And then now we're in a leadership position and we need to care about our people, right? So self-awareness forces us to look at not just our strengths and weaknesses as a leader, but what are our blind spots and what are our emotional triggers? Because emotional regulation is what you're talking about. You're talking about, how do I deal with people that see things differently than me? How do I deal with people that don't agree with me? And that's where empathy is the muscle that you can go back to say, I'm going to engage in this relationship in a more productive way. Not even just so we both feel good, but because we have to get results for our organization. So being self-aware is the first step in how you show up to the interaction. Whether the other person is empathetic or not is really not your concern. You're about showing up and creating the model for how the relationship's going to go. For example, one of the CEOs that I've researched talked about the fact that she finally realized, years into her career, that one of her emotional triggers was not being believed. So, someone says, well, you didn't say this, or we didn't agree to that, or whatever. And we all have had that moment where we get that email and all of a sudden we start going angrily back in our sent mail. Like, I know I sent it to them. And so she started realizing that that was a trigger for her. So she explored that. Why was that a trigger for her? Even if the person wasn't actually communicating that they didn't believe her, she was perceiving it as not being believed. And so what she was able to do was become more clear in those interactions, take a breath, take a step back, and say, let me actually ask them what they think is going on first.
Yes.
And 9 times out of 10, that's how she manages that conflict. That's how she manages that. But she wouldn't have realized that unless she started realizing and looking deep and saying, what's the commonality in these negative relationships I'm having with clients or with colleagues, and looking at that and saying, this is actually an emotional trigger for me. Why? And what can I do about it? So that self-awareness enables us not to blow up. And you're talking to a redheaded Italian here. So I am not the calmest person when it comes to getting attacked, but it's being able to take that pause, take that breath, and look at yourself from the outside in. And say, whoa, or I'm feeling it, right? I feel it in my body. I feel my heart rate getting faster. I feel my palms getting sweaty. I feel like I'm about to go off on this person. Let me take a step back and do something a little bit more constructive, because now I want to know what their point of view is and where they're coming from, because I could be misinterpreting it. And if I'm not, then at least we can have a conversation with clear heads.
Yes. It's that take a breath and don't react.
Yeah. Respond. Don't react. Easier said than done, I will admit.
Totally. When somebody cuts you up in traffic, it doesn't necessarily help to gesticulate and yell at them. And you feel like, it was instinctive. You didn't do it on purpose. And so it's like you have no self-control.
Right. And self-control is part of that self-awareness. And it's also about, being self-aware and being clear about your boundaries as well. We get resentful when a boundary is crossed. That's when we start to feel resentment. So if we start to feel resentment and anger towards someone, we may want to look at, was a boundary crossed? And if it was, is that fair? Did I actually communicate that boundary clearly to that person? Which is why clarity is the next pillar, the third pillar in the 5 pillars.
Well, it's this, we measure ourselves by our intent and others by actions. And so you're feeling that impact, but that might not be their intent because they had no idea. So go on, what was clarity? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so self-awareness, self-care, clarity, decisiveness, and joy are the 5 pillars.
Okay.
But they're all intertwined. And that's why when the whole point of it is to be a framework to say, if you're struggling with being an empathetic leader and still getting the best performance out of your people, or you're feeling burned out, or you're feeling misused, or you're feeling you're struggling, like your own capacity is being spent, you might want to look at one of these pillars to see if any one of them or more need to be strengthened. Because when those are all present, the pillars came from interviewing hundreds of leaders and working with leaders and folks that maybe didn't even self-identify as empathetic leaders, but they were identified as empathetic, and trying to deconstruct the recipe for what made them both empathetic and effective.
That's what I was going to ask is that this is a empathy/performance framework rather than just an empathy
it's
framework.
really just, it's not meant to be, it doesn't have to be linear, although I recommend starting with self-awareness. But it's one of those things where it's like you feel like you've lost control of your team in your efforts to be human-centered, in your efforts to be empathetic, which often we get wrong. We're not actually practicing empathy, we're doing something else. Look to these pillars and see if they're present for yourself and for your team culture. Because these were the common threads across all the research that I did, where in some way, shape, or form, these pillars were present with those leaders and those high-performing teams. Because we all know that leader, right? That leader that's like effortless about being great to work with and being there for their people. And, you know, they feel really approachable. They seem to always have time for you. You never know how they do it. How do they juggle their family life and their work life? And their teams are killing it, right? Their teams are actually really high performing. The quality hasn't gone down, which is another myth of if I'm empathetic, the quality is going to go down because we're all going to be coddling each other. So you look at them and I was like, what is making them so successful? What is that secret recipe? And they had to think about it. Some of them were like, some of them knew right away. Some of them that had intentionally worked on their empathy had told me, yeah, I've worked a really long time on self-awareness. I've worked hard on self-care and setting my boundaries. Or I realized our team didn't have clear expectations or a clear purpose or a clear mission. And that's where things went wrong. Everybody got, put in survivalist mode because they didn't know what step to take next. So for some of them, it was about pulling it out. For others, it was like, no, I intentionally worked on this. And those 5 traits, practices, whatever you want to call them, were present with all of those leaders. And so when you look at things, like I said, if you're struggling with balancing the needs of the business with the needs of your people, with your own needs, it's kind of like, let's look at these individual pillars and see if any of them are crumbling a little bit.
Let me interrupt the conversation just for a minute because I don't want you to miss this. My new book, Mind Your Fucking Business, is out on Amazon. If you're thinking yet another business book, I think you're wrong. This is actually a blueprint to cutting through the noise and achieving unparalleled success for you. It's based on 10 years of business coaching, spotting similar problems that people have had and coming up with real world solutions. If it's supercharging sales, if it's mastering talent acquisition, building a powerhouse brand, cultivating a company culture that breeds success, then this book is a ticket to your transformative journey. It's filled with practical tools and frameworks that I use every single day with my clients as part of their coaching program. If you want to take your business from good to great, look, you can go to Amazon and you can buy it, or you can click the link in the show notes and head over to monkhouseandcompany.com. I'll send it to you today. I'll send you a copy for free. I want to help you build a fantastic business. Now, back to the conversation. So, self-awareness, clarity,
self-care, self-awareness, self-care, clarity, decisiveness, and joy.
Decisiveness. So, expand a bit on decisiveness and joy for me.
So decisiveness, we often in the name, well, not we, but people that tend to want to be an empathetic leader or embrace empathy sometimes want to delay difficult decisions or crunchy conversations, as I like to call it, in the name of, well, I want to be empathetic. I want to be, I'm going to hurt this person's feelings, or this is just going to cause a conflict, right? They're conflict averse. But decisiveness is what gives people direction, right? So you're creating more stress and anxiety and fear within your team culture when you delay important decisions. Let me give you an example. So years ago, I was working with a brand strategy client, and the team was wonderful, and they were trying to make a decision. They were like a retail product, and they were trying to make a really important distribution decision about whether they're going to primarily go after distributing through retail outlets or going direct to consumer. Now, of course, they could do both, but from a brand story perspective, I had to know what their actual business model was, who was the primary audience and who was the secondary audience, so we could build messaging. And apparently this decision had been going on for months. And I only found out about it because everyone individually and confidentially fills out their pre-work. So I had this whole cross-functional management team, and they're all addressing this issue that the CEO has asked them relentlessly for months what they think. And they're like, we're done giving him our point of view. Like, he was being overly empathetic, right? They're like, at this point, we just need to make a decision so we can move forward. We don't know what to do. We don't know what to tell our teams. We don't know where to focus our priorities and our efforts. And they were like, please, can you do something in this workshop to drive this decision? And I saw it happen in the workshop, where even in the workshop, the CEO looked around and said, well, I don't know. What do you all think? And I was the one as the objective third party that had to say, look, appreciate that you're trying to get all these points of view, but part of leadership, I call this the leaderly part of leadership, is being able to synthesize multiple points of view swiftly and make a decision so people can move forward. So he thought he was being really democratic and empathetic and like, I want to hear from everybody. But really what he was doing was delaying the decision, because he was looking for a decision that was perfect.
Was he actually, I mean, I have come across people like that as well. I come across people like that often. And are they really being deliberately, empathetic? Or is it just there is a fear around making a decision? I had Matt Dixon on, who wrote the Jolt Effect. And he said, look, in 60% of cases where the buyer says yes, the deal never happens.
Yeah.
And it's because what they can do is they can go, right, this is the right deal for the company. But if I make a decision, I have now made a decision, right? And at that point, I can be blamed, but I can't ever be blamed for not making the decision.
Exactly.
And so that people get it stuck in that fear.
Yeah, it's fear
rather than totally deliberate empathy. Yeah,
right. But they mask it with, well, I'm.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. They pretend.
Now, I'm not saying this is a permission to be a dictator. The point is, like I said before, it's about being able to get different input and feedback, because that's important. That's how you avoid risks and how you embrace opportunities that you may not have seen. But you give it, one of the tips I give in the book is give yourself a decision-making deadline and communicate that to the team. Look, I want everyone's input. You can come see me one-on-one. We can have a group meeting. I might come talk to you, but I'm putting in my calendar that I'm making this decision next Friday. So it's like, speak now or forever hold your peace, right? But then you have to be responsible enough to say, I've got all the information I can get. Number one, there's no perfect decision that's going to be, risk-free. Number two, there's not going to be a decision that everyone loves. Like, again, that's the part of leadership. So you've got to go with your best information, knowing that you've gotten feedback and input from everybody and have a well-rounded picture. But then you have to make the decision. And then the other part of this decisiveness pillar is, how do I communicate that decision back? So you can communicate it back passive aggressively to say, this is the decision I've made and you just have to deal with it, right? Or you can say, look, this is the decision I made, and I really appreciated all of your input. It factored in very strongly into me making this decision. And Dominic, I really loved your idea about X. And we actually had a lot of thought about that. But here's why that's not part of this decision. So I'm transparently communicating to you that we listened and we factored in, but I'm explaining to you why that wasn't going to work in this particular decision. And further, I'm going to go, but Dominic, keep that feedback coming, because that was really valuable that you gave us that input. So I don't want to discourage you from giving feedback in the future by you thinking, well, my input doesn't really matter, because they're going to make whatever decision they want to make. So that's the step a lot of leaders miss in the decision-making process, is being able to empathetically communicate why the decision was made back to people and continue to encourage them to give feedback in the future.
The last one, joy. What's the unpack
What's that
a little
about?
bit?
Yeah.
Well, no, it's like some like things like clarity. It's like, it seems clarity, decisiveness, like joy could mean tons of things.
It could. Yeah.
The others, they are, the description you've got for the things underneath as we've unpacked them. I'm like, okay, get that. That all makes sense. But what's in the joy box?
So joy is really interesting, because initially I only had the 4 pillars. And then as I started doing more research and talking to more people on my podcast and doing trainings with people, I realized there was this other element. There was something else going on. And it wasn't humor. It wasn't like leaders had to be comedians, but it was an element of camaraderie. It was an element of levity, even when the work gets hard. We're talking about even in emergency rooms at hospitals or police stations, right? That's really stressful work. But can you create a team environment where people can laugh at themselves, where people can make mistakes and own up to them, and they're not going to be punished for it, right? Where you're alleviating as much fear and anxiety and stress as you can, because when we operate under fear, anxiety, and stress, our executive functions shut down. And I don't know one leader that wants everyone on their team thinking with half a brain, right? We want to innovate. We want to create. We want to problem solve. We need to be fully functioning. So what I mean by joy is that element of you actually enjoy being there, even when the work is tough. It doesn't mean the work's always joyful, like budget spreadsheets are not always joyful, right? But it's about how are you creating that environment where you're encouraging work friendships, for example. There's a lot of data around the fact that if you have a friend at work, your engagement goes up, your performance goes up, and your absenteeism goes down, which makes sense, right? We want to be around these people. They don't have to be our best friends, but if we have a friend and we are friendly with people at work, then it's a better environment where we want to engage and we actually care about people as people. So we're going to be there for each other more. It doesn't mean we have to go out for drinks every night, but are you as a leader, not that you're the one that has to bring all the joy, right? It's not all on you. You can look to your team to bring ideas, to bring suggestions. What's a fun Slack channel we can have that is not work related? What's a team building activity that we can do that I'm not deciding as the leader? You guys decide and you figure out what you want to do. So are you bringing that element into the work?
It occurs to me, I remember listening to Robin Dunbar on a podcast, and he was being asked about remote work versus office work. Mm-hmm. And he said human beings, evolutionary, we like to build relationships. It seems to me that if high-performing teams is a thing, then you are more likely to want to put people face-to-face rather than on Zoom. Because I've spent hours and hours and hours with people on Zoom, mm-hmm. but none of them are remotely my best friends, right? I actually have to go and hang. No, but to build relationships, I've just done sort of 4 days away in Lanzarote with a group of coaches, and we know each other so much better after that than we have done mm-hmm. after years of talking on Zoom. It feels mm-hmm. as though this thing about joy, it's just so much harder online versus remote. It can be, but also innovation doesn't happen within four walls. Neither does culture. Culture is the way we work together. It doesn't mean we have to be in the same room. I kind of take both sides of the return to work argument, return to office argument, because on the one hand, we proved during the pandemic that people can work in different ways. We opened up our talent pool by enabling people who couldn't come into an office for whatever reason to contribute their best work. We created safe environments for people that have certain neurodiverse needs or disabilities to be able to contribute and be part of it. But there's also, the blanket, everybody get back into the office is not the solution either. Like, we have gone through a workplace transformation. The reason, again, I wrote this book is because I was troubled by this idea from leaders that, okay, you had your fun being treated like human beings. Now it's time to get back to work, right? No, we have fundamentally had a workplace and a culture and a leadership paradigm shift. And the leaders that get curious and want to understand what that new paradigm is and grow their skill set are going to succeed. Now, I also understand a business has to run and they have to do what's right for them. And if they make those difficult decisions of, look, I know people don't want to return to the office. Number one, can they experiment? Can they be flexible? Or are they just succumbing to the fears of leaders who are like, I don't know any other way to lead unless I can see everybody, right? So I'm getting off topic a little bit, but there's this idea that, we have to have this understanding. I love, I interviewed the chief HR officer at Box, the file sharing company. And I love their approach. They're experimenting. They're like, no one knows how to do this. So stop pretending that there's one way
to do this whole return to office hybrid work. So they've been experimenting with different models and keeping lines of communication open with their people. What's working for you, what's not, what's working for the leader, what's not. But they're also being discerning, and the best companies are, they're being discerning about when they actually need to have everybody together physically and when they don't. And your weekly status meeting, you don't all need to be together. Your strategic brainstorming session for the year, yeah, you might want to all be together. The problem is everyone's trying to put a blanket solution onto it rather than saying, let's be discerning and thoughtful about when we bring people together and when we don't actually need to be in the same room and we can work asynchronously.
Totally. Bringing everyone back into the office so they can sit on Zoom calls seems
100%. Yeah.
Completely pointless.
Yeah.
Totally pointless. Right. I've got some quick fire questions for you. You ready?
Ooh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Let's go.
What drives you every day?
A vision of a better workplace and a better world. I feel like if we can master empathy in our workplace where we spend the bulk of our time, it will spill over into our personal lives and into our communities and into our larger world. Because basically I'm trying to build a better world for my son.
Fab. That's fab. I completely agree. I think about, look, the companies that I've run, we've ended up winning awards for being great places to work. And people have said, why do you bother? And it's like, well, because actually most people work in companies that are a bit shit.
Yeah.
Right? And they don't like their job and they don't like their boss and they don't have a friend at work. And so they go home on a Friday.
Moods. Yeah.
And they go home on a Friday miserable. But if you go home on a Friday happy, then, everything spills over into the community. So what's your genius?
Oh, I think it's dot connecting. I know you might have thought I was going to say empathy, but I'm not an expert at empathy. Just ask my husband and my son. He's like, really? You write books about empathy? I'm constantly working at it. So yeah, just this morning in my house would have proved that to you. But I feel like I'm really good at dot connecting, at seeing things that other people can't see and understanding the connection between them and also making connections between people. I feel like that's a superpower.
Okay. What unpopular opinion do you hold?
Oh my gosh, so many. I mean, I think, my work right now, especially in the United States, is getting hit with some hard, no, we have to act a certain way. We can't appreciate differences. We have to be always looking out for ourselves. I think, I live, and you live, we live in societies that are very individualistic. And I'm trying to move us to being a little bit more collaboration minded because I see the power in that. And that can seem controversial to people at times.
Okay. What's the most significant risk you've taken?
I think when I went off on my own in 2008, I'd always been a corporate gal, both sides, client and agency, worked for very large global companies, worked for small, scrappy startups. And I went off on my own in 2008 and had to learn not just how to build my skills in what I was doing, but learn how to run a business, learn how to work for myself, to do business development for myself, to do all of these things. And it was a huge risk, but that was, 2008. I'm still going. So it's going well. It's not always perfect, but it's going well.
Very good. How do you measure success?
I mean, I think, what I want to say is, it's the time spent with my family. It's the being able to integrate the needs of my work with the needs of my personal life. I'm starting to, as I get older, I'm 52 now, I'm starting to get into this idea of success is if you feel mentally healthy and strong and you're still succeeding at your work. That's kind of the balance for me of success.
Okay. What's the most recent thing you've learned or skill you've acquired?
I think that I'm always taking courses and I'm always reading books. So I'm trying to think what skill I've acquired. Okay, there's an example. Last year, I got into the guts of developing an online course, and the coaching program I was in forced you to do all the tech yourself before you hire anybody else to do it. Uh-huh. And I hate doing the tech stuff. I hate getting in the back end. I don't even want to know. I don't even want to fill my brain. I have a virtual assistant that does most of that work for me. And I forced myself to put this program in place with minimal help from anyone else. And it was really tough, but I did it. So I was pretty proud of myself.
Fantastic back-end architect.
Yeah, no,
and
no,
what?
no more, not again.
And what do you think is the biggest myth in business?
That empathy is a weakness and not a strength. That's for sure. You actually have to be really strong to be able to take on someone else's point of view without defensiveness or fear. So if you can be an empathetic leader and achieve high performance, it means you are self-confident. It means you are sure of your values, and it means you stand strong in your own skin. And the people that can't be empathetic leaders are often very scared, very insecure, and very wary of making connections with people.
Fantastic. What about some other books other than The Empathy Edge and your new book, The Empathy Dilemma, that we've been talking about today? What else do you recommend people pick up along the way?
Yeah. So Rob Volpe is a fellow empathy activist with me. He wrote a book called Tell Me More About That. That's really about, it gives you sort of a framework for how to be more empathetic in actual conversations. Rob comes from the customer insight world, running a research company and sharing a lot of the lessons in how he built connections with people who were very different from him. Minette Norman, who I know you've spoken to, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, is a great book. It's on your bookshelf. Yeah. Two of them I'm in the middle of reading right now. Super Psyched, Unleash the Power of the 4 Types of Connection by Dr. Adam Dorsey is a great book for understanding how to shore up connection with yourself and connections with other people and connections with your greater world. And then finally, Unbreakable Alliances by Robin Dreeke. He's a former FBI agent who leans in a lot on his experiences of working to convert enemy combatants into spies.
Oh, wow.
And leveraging empathy, not coercion, not force, to find common ground and find what was meaningful for those people and being able to build those relationships and build those connections. But he talks about it in the context of corporate life and work. How can leaders build unbreakable alliances?
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Right. Another few books to go by and read.
I know, too many.
Oh, it's fab. It is just a joy to get smart people on to recommend books to me. It's just, and the audience, but it's just, because I, in fact, the other day I was just thinking, I look on Amazon and all it does is it just gives me a list of bestsellers. And really what I want is I don't necessarily want a book that 1 million people have read. I want a book that I want to read that's really, really good, that maybe nobody's read or few people have read.
Can I give you one more that I can't believe I forgot? It's one of the best books I've read in recent years. It's called Unlocking Generational Codes. The author is Anna Liotta, and her name looks like Anna, A-N-N-A. She is a generational expert, and I truly believe it's one of the most useful books I've read on the generational differences and how to navigate that in the workplace. Not from here's typical stereotypes of each generation, but really understanding why different generations act the way they do and why they view things the way they do, from professionalism to communication to information sharing. And it gives great advice on how to navigate some of that generational conflict that I'm sure many of your listeners deal with every day. We have 5 generations working in the workplace right now. So empathy and understanding is vital.
Serendipitously, I was asked if I wanted to comment on something like that for an article last week. And I said, I think that generational difference stuff's just a load of bollocks. It's like, it's like astrology. So I am in need of education on this topic. So I'll put that on the list as well. That's fantastic. Maria,
you'll love it.
It's been absolutely fab having you on. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from California today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.